Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to you and Rose for the invitation to be here. I will try to talk quickly as well to make up for some time.
It's cool, you've got all the time you need.
Thank you. So everyone, just a quick intro, I guess. I started out as a land use planner in Los Angeles, California, where I am from. And over the years, has somehow moved into being a social scientist, working at the University of Lapland, which is in Rovaniemi, Finland, in the Arctic, on environmental issues in the Arctic, but also on social license to operate in the Nordic countries, as well as more in the pan-European context. So with that, I will share my screen. And okay. So as Sarah said, this presentation will introduce you to a toolbox we developed for a project called MIREU, which is an acronym for Mining and Metallurgy Regions EU. Now, a little bit of background on MIREU. MIREU is a Horizon 2020 project, which is one of those projects that's funded under the European Commission Research Agenda. The main aim of MIREU actually was to network mining and metallurgy regions across Europe through regional administrations. So that was the focus. And part of this comes, of course, from the European Commission now wanting to restart mining in the name of security of supply, for the energy transition, for the Green Deal, for all of these things. MIREU was a really big project because it was about networking. 29 partners, 10 work packages, and I'll mention this in a little bit. The social license to operate work package, which I led, is just 1 out of 10 in this project. The project officially ended recently on April 30th. And I think one of the things that made MIREU very distinct and perhaps opened up the debate wider than it normally would have, is that we decided to try to walk the talk. I mean, we in the SLO work package opened this up to anybody. Anybody from anywhere could join. And they could be a part of the email list, which was not just about newsletters. It wasn't that. There really was a passion actually to try to understand SLO in the European context. And we would have these long email discussions, one around 62 pages, trying to understand what SLO is, how it functions, what its aims are. And we also had monthly calls. We were debating a lot of this substantively. So we made all of our internal discussions open to anybody and everyone. And it's been a really interesting learning experience, and also about transparency and how one handles that. And I've learned I can do that much better. So many lessons on many levels. The big deliverables that we're supposed to come up with were European Union level social license to operate guidelines and an accompanying toolbox. And again, the idea was to try to standardize SLO in the European context, which is a tall order. But I think we made a lot of headway on that, actually. So here's an overview of the toolbox. We went through all of the toolboxes we could find around exploration and mining. And the big demand in Europe was really about relationship building. Okay, what do we say when we first go out and meet communities? I mean, how do we build relationships that are supposed to be long-lasting, based on trust? We know we're supposed to do this, but how? How do we do it? So we started thinking about, okay, how do you build a relationship? And then we were thinking, should this apply to the mine life cycle? This is how things are normally divided up. And yet relationship building is cross-cutting across all the stages of mining and across everything. So we just decided to look at the different stages of relationship building, starting with familiarize, then you introduce yourself, you establish the relationship a little bit more, then you really reach out and start to collaborate, and then you strengthen, ideally with something like an impact and benefit agreement and something that's more contractual and has more teeth to it. We developed tools for each of the activities. And the idea of this whole thing is that you can mix and match the tools wherever you are in the relationship process with an individual, with a group. Choose the tools that work for you. And it's funny, I didn't change the slide. But okay, I'm not sure if I'm losing control of my slideshow. This is the toolbox for Europe, however. So you'll see that the relationship building activities are on the left-hand side. The tools we developed are in this tools category. There are 15 tools. Some were developed from the MIREU project. Some were just developed. Actually, we adapted from Canada, and I'll show you those later. We categorize, which tools were most useful for which groups, although the majority are for companies. At the end of the day, we also realize these debates are just starting and you need to level the playing field. I'm sorry, you know what? I think I don't know what's happening. I'm not switching the slides, but they seem to be going automatically. So, sorry, well, it'll help me speed up the presentation. The ones that you see in yellow, and I won't go through all of those. I think in some ways, perhaps the more interesting tools are almost the ones we've adapted from Canada, or at least some of them. And especially these financial mechanisms to encourage SLO, because the Canadians have been dealing with this engagement issue and SLO for decades. They have figured out, how do you incentivize engagement, engagement and exploration at the same time. And these financial mechanisms are just targeted to exploration. And they do this actually by having engagement being a legitimate tax deduction, and this is incorporated into the tax code. Legislation was then devised that actually brings kind of these tax incentives into the regulatory framework. And so I think there's some lessons that can be tailored to Europe on that, actually. Grievance mechanism, you're all probably familiar with these environmental monitoring plans, although very standard in much of the world. In Europe, the idea of having the community participate in environmental monitoring is rather new. Same with these community agreements, which are impact and benefit agreement light, essentially. And there was a lot of pushback from industry actually against these, because this somehow binds them contractually. On the other hand, there are also industry people who are participating that were very much for this, as were NGOs, as were authorities, realizing that if you want to actually create a framework to implement SLO and to track that, you need to have some kind of concrete agreement. And this is required already by the World Bank and all these funding institutions. So why not in Europe? But this will be an interesting debate, I think we'll see in the future. And just to go quickly over this, we stepped back and we were looking at stakeholder mapping, because this is one of the big issues going on in Europe of how do you know who your stakeholders are, who can issue an SLO, who cannot. For this presentation, I'm just focusing on this very last box on number 4. And the idea then for this part was not to look at stakeholders in terms of what they do. Are they government? Are they industry? Are they NGO? Are they local community? What are they? It was to shift that to what do they value? What do they believe in, especially in terms of issuing an SLO or of a project gaining acceptance? What has to be in place? And these are trying to reach the more fundamental values people have. So we did this through a survey called the Perceptions of Mining in Europe. It was run across Europe in 7 languages. The idea was not that this was a large-scale random survey. The idea was that we would start with the MIREU partners and try to reach people with some knowledge of mining. And we came up with an SLO model for the MIREU project. This survey tested the model. That's what we did. And we wanted to see, we were testing drivers of social license in Europe. We wanted to see, are there groupings of drivers? Do they somehow come together? And indeed they do, actually. And you'll see these in these stakeholder frames. So for example, the first stakeholder frame is the more traditional idea of SLO, where the company and the the company and the community collaborate, work together, kind of developing, anything from part of the design of a project, through the monitoring, these ongoing relationships. But then there are other groupings that talked about how the societal acceptance of mining in Europe is important. And this goes to the debates about post-consumerism and how much should we really be consuming? Do we need that much mining? What commodities do we need? I'm sorry, it's going. And the third stakeholder frame is actually quite important, and I'll come back to that in a later slide, because government plays a very strong role in SLO in Europe. But the idea of these frames is not that an individual fits in one. They can fit in all 5. Groups can fit in all 5. The idea is that these are really crucial issues that will come up in any mining project across Europe. And for industry and government, to start building these relationships and start being able to even just get an SLO, you have to consider these and you have to try at least to answer them, but expect they'll come up. So the other tool now are these indicators we came up with to measure SLO, and measurement is a big thing. Just want to put forward that any measurement is a snapshot in time. That is it. But snapshots in time are also helpful for seeing if you're on the right track to getting SLO or not, and what's happening. So the basic idea is you establish a baseline SLO. And here you can see this in the preliminary checklist, the table to the left. Now, the levels on the left, gosh, I'm really sorry. It's okay. The levels on the left correspond to the model that we developed. And we looked at the drivers of gaining SLO and the drivers of losing SLO. This preliminary checklist comes from the model as well. We looked at how these drivers manifest themselves in Europe. Then, the table on your left would establish a baseline SLO. Then the table on your right is how you would measure community SLO. Again, the levels on the left are from the model. We were just interested in, this is a fight. We were just interested in gaining SLO. So the components here come from the model. The measurements are a mix of quantitative indices like this economic index and labor index, as well as a stakeholder survey we've developed, and you'll see on the next slide. So it's capturing also the qualitative aspects of SLO. So these two, quantitative and qualitative, measure the community dimension. And now moving on, the table on the left measures the societal. Again, the levels correspond to the model. The components correspond to the manifestation of how these drivers look in Europe. These are measured against the social sustainable development goals. And the idea being SDGs are very mainstream. People accept them as kind of the societal good practice. And if you're trying to meet the SDGs, somehow there should be a societal acceptance around them. Then the survey, you'll see to the table on your right. And it's basically just some basic questions. This is taken partly from what Robert Boutillier did in a paper in 2017. And Ian Thompson also, worked with him earlier on these issues. So it's basically kind of measuring certain key drivers that people have found across the world on SLO and ranking them. And the idea is then you add up all of the scores and you get your total project SLO score. So last slide here, thoughts for future uptake. Because this was really collaboratively done, we consistently worked with about 150 people across Europe, partners and non-partners in MIREU, people who are interested in it and who join the calls constantly. There was a lot of input and it took a lot of time to develop the tools. So I should have thought better about how do you get people to take these up? How do you get government interested, which is really initially who they were supposed to be for, and industry interested? And I think what's really true in Europe is you see the case for mining actually has not been well made. There are areas where there's been mining, where there will continue to be mining. It's supported, but this largely is because of identity and history and jobs. In other regions, I think people are very much questioning why they need it. They don't see that as the future of Europe. They see Europe beyond this, of course, IT and services, which requires a lot of mining, but that connection hasn't quite been made. And when we asked companies, when we finally got this developed and we said, okay, will you test these? Some of the companies told us, look, we do SLO better than you ever could. We don't need this. Others told us there are no issues, there are no problems, don't raise them. We don't want to do anything. We just want to hold back and let things go on as they have been. And then there are a lot of others who said, we tried communication and it really didn't work. And we really don't want to open ourselves up again. So there really is a need to think through, gosh, how do you get people to use these? On the last point, it goes to that other slide where I mentioned government plays a really strong role. And because the state historically has been strong, the welfare state models, is still very supported in Europe. And authorities view their roles as being quite structured and strict. And so the idea of bringing in more of this soft law stuff of social license, is something that they don't understand how to integrate because it is not there in legislation or in regulation. So trying to understand how you really mesh these things together so they're usable is a big challenge, but something also that really needs to be done. So, okay, I think my presentation wanted me to finish earlier. I'm sorry. Say if you have any questions or you want to discuss anything, please always feel free to contact me.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Pamela. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Pamela Lesser. Thank you very much, Pamela. That was brilliant.
Sorry
So just
about that.
one very, very quick question, and I know that there are some questions in the chat for you. You mentioned things like the issuing of an SLO or getting that as a tangible thing. Now, as far as I was aware, a social license to operate isn't a physical piece of paper. It's something that's fairly transient. And am I correct in that, or am I misinterpreting something?
You are. No, you are very correct in that. And I probably shouldn't have used that word. There's no tangible paper. There is no license that is being issued. And that is one of the confusions, and also why at least authorities in Europe don't like it, because it confuses, the real license or the license they issue with. Basically, the idea was also saying that the community acceptance is just as important as a legal license. This is the basis of it, but there's no tangible piece of paper.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pamela. And then the other thing as well there is that, so within Europe, there isn't actually, compared to somewhere like Canada, Australia, parts of Africa, there's not actually very much physical mining. There's a lot of old mining, and there's potential for a lot of new mining coming in. Is that something where actually the social license to operate is something that is very different, say in the European context, compared to something like the Canadian context? Would that be true?
It is true. You look at Canada and you look at Australia, and these are mining countries. Mining is part of their identity. Not true in general in Europe. Yes, there are places, and Cornwall is definitely one of these, where mining is part of their heritage and they're very proud of it, and it will continue to be, and their identity is bound up with mining. But in much of Europe, no. And also, when you do look at just the numbers and how it contributes to GDP and all that, it's a very small percentage. So making the argument that we are going to have environmental and social impacts, no doubt, we will do this as best as we can, as responsibly as we can, but there will be impacts. For a very small part of the economy, and it tends to be in rural, underdeveloped areas, it's not an easy argument to make.
And one final question as well is that, so whilst I guess my inference there was around things like base metal mines, for example, of course, there's a huge construction materials industry. And the work that you did, was that primarily focused in on things like base metals, or did you also include quarries and construction materials?
MIREU was only about metals. We didn't look at quarries. That's it. Because social license to operate, I think you have to include it. It's such a huge part of the mining in Europe that you need to. So we actually included quarries, and we also looked at coal, which was also not part of MIREU. So we were trying to capture everything in what we did.
Cool. Brilliant. Well, with that, thank you very, very much, Pamela. Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for Pamela. Thank you very much.